Genocide, a legal post-World War II term that is retrofitted to ghastly historical and ancient events. Armenia is one of many, many examples. What can it tell us about its nature and our nature? And has the very word genocide been defined out of all meaning? Join me, Darasz, for How We Got Here.
How do we trace the roots of something as dark and vile as ethnic hatred? In the case of the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey, the trail leads to a murky mix of religious, social, political, economic and nationalist factors. Firstly, it was the complex social system of Millet. Within it, Armenians were classified as dhimmi, and to the so-called dominated Millets. Although protected, the dhimmi status imposed social and legal inferiority, including extra taxes, limitations on religious expression, and restrictions on arms and public office. This religious difference reinforced a sense of otherness, which could be easily mobilized during times of unrest. Secondly, Armenians' knack for trade frequently rendered them prosperous, springboarding them into strong positions in finance, artisanal industries, banking, and even civil service in urban areas. Their economic success fostered resentment among the predominantly Muslim population of the empire, particularly in eastern Anatolia, where Armenians and Muslims competed for land and resources. While the Millet system was abolished in 1839 amid the rise of Turkish nationalism and the reformist movement known as the Tanzimat, resentment continued against now bolder Armenian calls for greater freedom and even independence. The Hamidian massacre of 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians between 1894 and 1896 became a grim harbinger or even greater evil to come.
Our guest today, I'm delighted to welcome Adam Michalski, a great friend to the programme. He's the Research Fellow at the Department for Turkey, Caucasus and Central Asia Centre for Eastern Studies. Welcome once more to the programme.
Pleasure to be here.
Our clip there showed Turkey as a multi-ethnic empire, tensions within that empire. It's a thing that all empires have, a tension between minorities or large minorities, small minorities, and a ruling culture. Is that an accurate thing to portray in Turkey in the early part of the 20th century?
I mean, I think that the Ottoman Empire was to some extent quite an exception. I mean, if we look at the vast territories that it controlled, it spanned across various cultures and religions. And I mean, the mentioned in the video, Millet system, which was a way of governance which gave some form of religious autonomy in return, of course, for paying taxes to these various religious groups which were under the domain of the Ottoman Empire. It created a very interesting political model that allowed these communities to coexist within some bigger imperial model. And that actually worked for centuries until you had the 19th century, and slowly but surely through Europe and through the world you had these kind of waves of self-determination starting to blow, and the acceptance of a new international model based not on empires, but on the nation state as this kind of main mode of governance, of constituting people, where the nation equals the state, not the empire. And I think that the moment we had these kind of fissures start to bring up, you've also had another element which came to the fore when it came to the Ottoman Empire, and it was of course wars which were weakening it, wars with other imperial empires, Britain, France, but mainly also Russia, which was bit by bit taking territories in the Balkans, in the Caucasus. And all of that, was built on this whole moment where, where this multi-ethnic empire, the Ottoman Empire, was slowly starting to, become smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where the people in its, very kind of interior, in Istanbul, in central Anatolia, were starting to question, well, are we still a multi-ethnic empire built on the old kind of ideas of ruling of these millets, of, this kind of, multicultural imperial empire, or are we starting to become, you know, a group of people, particularly Turks, who are being, you know, besieged by many empires for their own personal deeds, and this, as a result, kind of started to slowly bring up this whole nationalistic element in the Ottoman Empire, not only within the minorities, but also in the majority, which was, you know, the Turks themselves, who were kind of the main people in the Ottoman Empire at that time.
And I mean, it's a phenomenon that affected countries like Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century. The Russian Empire was undergoing a similar development in the First World War. Hungarian Empire, of course. Was this a general feature of empires, that they just get too big and vociferous to control, or was this a nationalist strain, as you mentioned, in the 19th century? One ethnic group starts to dominate. How did the Turks view the empire in the early parts of the First World War? Who was a Turk? Was it an Armenian, or was it an ethnic Turk?
So I mean, the end of the Ottoman Empire sparks, well, the last 2-3 decades of end of the Ottoman Empire spark a very interesting debate within Istanbul, which of course at that time was the capital of the Ottoman Empire itself, in terms of, you know, who we are in terms of the people that constitute that remainder of the land, which was then still considered to be under the control of Istanbul. And so you had 3 strands of thought. Well, one of them was, you know, we could think of ourselves, and I'm talking about the people sitting in, you know, in Istanbul, the Sultan, saying that, you know, we can think of ourselves as a kind of Islamic community, right? A pan-Islamic community stretching across the Balkans, across the Middle East, and that our identity is built more about our religious affiliation, you know, and this is one of the ways how we can look at the kind of subject of the Ottoman Empire. The other element was to consider, for example, to look at the people living within the empire as Turks, but Turks from different branches, which was built on this idea of pan-Turkism, right? That there are many Turks who span not only from the central Anatolia, which is kind of the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but they go all the way through the Caucasus to Central Asia, and that, you know, this Ottoman Empire is also a kind of pan-Turkist idea, where you have, you know, Turks of various, from different walks and from different regions. But the most common discussion that became prevalent in that time was actually to consider Turks as a national unit, not as pan-Turkism, but as Turkishness, which was related specifically to the people who were living in Central Anatolia, which were always considered to be Turks, the official Turks who were also considered to be ruling the Ottoman Empire and who sat at the throne and who were, you know, kind of responsible for managing. But the idea was to think not in terms of imperial mindset, that, you know, we are part of a bigger community, but to think in terms of national kind of paradigms, that, you know, Turks who live in a very specific, you know, part of the world, and who have a state, right? Not an empire, a state that is, you know, subordinated to their interests, not to the interest of, you know, multinational groups. And so this was the idea that became prevalent, and this was particularly seen throughout the Young Turk era, which is the last 2 decades of the Ottoman Empire, where you see this kind of slow but sure kind of movement away from empire towards the making of the Turkish Republic, of the Turkish people, which Mustafa Kemal Atatürk during World War I was essentially, you know, kind of brought all of that together, right? But the process started many, many decades before.
What were the pressures in the First World War that the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was undergoing? A war in the Caucasus, war in the Dardanelles, a war in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula.
No.
Was Turkey was Turkey losing, I suppose, to use shorthand. Did it feel under that sort of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, so Turkey was, and this was, I think, the main prevalent narrative at that time, was that Turkey was essentially, or the Ottoman Empire was being partitioned by great powers for their own personal needs.
Which it was in the end, I suppose.
And these empires were not only having a say in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire, of how they should treat their minorities, forcing oftentimes Istanbul to grant more and more rights or, tax deductions to these minorities, to the point where people were questioning in Istanbul at that time, whether the minorities actually had more rights than the Turk himself. And so you have this moment where, not only the Ottoman Empire is being shredded into pieces bit by bit, but at the same time, the final outcome of its defeat or its final kind of disintegration is being dictated by countries which have nothing to do with this region. And as a result, you end up with this kind of climax of kind of distrust towards the West, and the fact that Turks themselves are starting to become a minority. And this is where you have the First World War with Ataturk coming into power and bringing a stop to this kind of partition of the Ottoman Empire, trying to salvage what was left of it, and starting a war of liberation, of independence, trying to restore some of that territory which was supposed to go to many other national groups like Greeks, Armenians, to Syrians, and to stop the process of having imperial powers decide the fate of your own country. And this is, of course, what leads to a lot of the problems that we have in terms of the current Turkey, and how different populations were resettled from what was still then a very multi-ethnic empire.
Well, that's right. I mean, what was the pressure? What was the Armenian society? If we can do a broad brush analysis, were they content to be in the structure of a Turkish empire, or were they agitated by external factors such as Christian Russia to break away and form their own national?
I mean, the Armenian
society.
population was, I think, very also kind of divided, because you had the Armenians in Istanbul, for example, which were much more wealthier people, but also people who I would say had a completely different lifestyle to, for example, the Armenians who were living in eastern Turkey in the province of Van, where you had Russian, for example, influence, incentivizing them to kind of rebel against the Ottoman authorities. So I wouldn't say that there was one Armenian living at that time in Turkey, especially that the idea of Armenia as a nation state was still kind of a loose concept when it came to that. So there were definitely Armenians who were willing to remain within the Ottoman Empire, who were willing to, accept it as a multi-ethnic empire and to be one of its elements. And then, of course, there were Armenians who were very much stoked into doing similar things or believing into the similar ideas that you've had, many other people, for example, in the Balkans and around the world, come to a conclusion that, we want a self-governing state. And so as a result, at the critical moment where you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing, you also have some form of revolts. You have a growing tension between Turkish communities and Armenian communities, each kind of growing for their own version of independence. And this becomes particularly prevalent in eastern Turkey, where one of the elements of why you had so many deaths, for example, on the Armenian side, was that in Istanbul people were worried, the Ottoman government was worried that Russia was, for example, using these people to create more chaos and to later on grant them territory. So as a result, the Ottoman Empire said, we will resettle them to a place where we can give them that territory, but not central Anatolia.
We'll stop there and have a look at the second clip, which will bring the story forward.
The Committee of Union and Progress rose to power after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. Initially promising equality for all citizens, including Armenians, the Young Turks quickly went back on their promises. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, as well as further territorial losses, pushed CUP to adopt a more aggressively Turkish and nationalist agenda, seeking to Turkify the remaining empire. This rendered the ground ripe for scapegoating Armenians as a fifth column. These tendencies grew stronger during World War I, when Turkey joined the Central Powers and went to war with Russia and Persia. both hosting large Armenian communities. While Russian Armenians welcomed the conflict enthusiastically, Ottoman Armenians were disinclined to spill their blood for Turks and clash with their relatives from the other side of the border. Still, Turkey would continue drafting Ottoman Armenians, with at least 10% mobilized. This military draft of fighting-age men, also the best fit community protectors from Armenian communities, greatly limited Armenians' resistance capabilities against deportations. These came in 1915, amidst the Turkish narrative of Armenian betrayal, with the cities of Sivas, Mush, and Erzurum being the main deportation centers. Once gathered, over 1 million Armenians were led on grueling death marches to the Turkish-made desert death camps of Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor. On their way to almost certain death, the deportees were deprived of food and water, robbed, raped, and killed in unpredictable outbursts of violence by paramilitary escorts, often consisting of not just Turks, but also Chechens, Circassians, and nomadic Kurds. The same horror unfolded in the camps, including children being sold into slavery. Up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed in the genocide between 1915 and 1917. Their real estate, then left vacant, was redistributed to Muslims, laying bare the calculated foundation of the genocide: economic envy and a misconstrued idea of national unity.
Just a question on the actual policy of the Ottoman Empire. Was it a conscious policy to was it resettle, or to resettle with a view to just let the community, let these Armenian prisoners just fade away or die? How did that work?
I mean, the policy of resettlement was absolutely intentional on the side of the Ottoman Empire at that time. And I mean, the logic behind that was what I've explained, alluded to previously, in a sense that, you know, when you've had external imperial powers telling these minorities within your own state to revolt against, for example, Istanbul and the Ottoman Sultan, or to, you know, strive towards creating its own empire at a time when the Ottoman Empire itself was being, you know, cut up into smaller and smaller bits. Well, one of the solutions to that was to, you know, perhaps move these people somewhere else, so that an argument towards, you know, national liberation could not be made within these territories, especially that these territories were being disputed at that time, because you had a mix of Turkish and Armenian populations. And so, yeah, I mean, to some extent, these deportations were supposed to, you know, alleviate these problems, and they were calculated to do that. But I mean, the outcome of them, of course, was a little bit drastic. And here, of course, we have varying degrees of what actually happened during these deportations, where, you know, some people say, particularly the kind of more historical, the Western side of the historical debate, and Armenians, you know, are talking about millions, 1.5 million people who have died during these deportations, and that, you know, you could call it a genocide because it was, you know, forced, because it was because many people died at the same time, and that it was planned by the Ottoman Empire. However, you know, you also have a stark difference when it comes to what, you know, Turkey, for example, argues, mentioning that, you know, this was, of course, a event that led to many deaths, but it led to deaths not only of Armenians, it led to the deaths of Turks also, and of clashes which happened during that time between these communities, and that, you know, while the migration was a fact and the deportation was a fact, you know, it wasn't a planned murder of these people, and first of all, and most importantly, the numbers are completely of different various degrees. Turkey, for example, says that maybe a couple hundreds have died, you know, 200, 300,000, not the millions that are being quoted by other historians. And so as a result, this whole kind of discussion around these deportations is very kind of divided between almost, you know, completely two different narratives, and it's very hard to find a way, you know, to figure out exactly which side is the one that, you know, has the most accurate way of depicting it. And this is why we, you know, every single year when we do have the commemoration of the Armenians, this topic comes back, and it is a highly problematic question, which of course many states kind of still go into this debate of whether it was a genocide or not.
It's narrative versus historians' work. I mean, historians have to take into account context, however brutal and harrowing it is. Is it a problem with the actual terminology we use nowadays? Genocide. It's Rafał Lemkin, great Polish lawyer, who coined the phrase. Killing members of the group, causing serious body or mental harm to members of the group, etc., etc. The UN Convention on Genocide. Is it something that we just retrofit it to any kind of historical event which sees horrible things happening? Is everything a genocide? I suppose that's the.
I mean, I think
a short question.
Well, this is, of course, the problem with terminologies like that, especially terminologies which were developed, well, I think almost close to a century ago, or approaching that timeline, where we're looking at the effects of World War II, where we saw the mass execution of Jews. It was planned, it was orchestrated, there was clear proof. But the problem with applying, for example, this term to some of the atrocities being committed today, but particularly to the atrocities that were committed even before World War II, is that well, we do not have this kind of full evidence. Well, sometimes we do not have this definition of what actually is the threshold for considering something to be a genocide. And I mean,
the intention or numbers or
exactly. So one of those elements is of considering it to be a genocide is that it is an intentional killing of a particular group of people. How do you specify whether something is intentional, right? If a deportation was only supposed to be a deportation and more deaths happened during that time, is this therefore a genocide? If for some people this was just a result of perhaps a badly carried out process, or of communities perhaps fighting and fighting each other, which as a result made the death counts even bigger. So this as a result means that with this current definition that we have, you can pretty much label anything as a genocide, and at the same time you can make an argument that nothing is a genocide. And this is, I think, the biggest issue that we have when we talk about the events of 1915 in the Ottoman Empire with regards to the Armenian population, is that this terminology of a genocide is to some extent even politicized. And this is what Turkey considers, that a lot of Western states have kind of chosen the Armenian side because they're closer in terms of religion to the West, and kind of picking this kind of dualism that of course the Armenians must have suffered the casualties that they did, and this for Turkey is very hard to accept because Ankara considers it to be a bad incident, a event which led to unfortunately lots of deaths, but it cannot be considered as an orchestrated plan from Istanbul to carry out, particularly the young Turks, to carry out such a thing. And so the problem, as we mentioned, it really brings itself down what the definition of genocide is, what type of criteria do we apply, how many people have to die in order for it to be considered a genocide.
Final question to you, Mr. Mihaly. How is the response evolving from Turkey to these accusations of genocide, and how does it treat its historical narrative? How does it treat these accusations that Turkey is genocidal power? How does it respond?
Yeah, I mean, well, Turkey is, of course, it talks openly about the events of 1950. I mean, Turkey doesn't try to hide that, there were problems that happened, but it always accentuates that the problems should be seen not only through the prism of an Armenian interpretation of it, being only directed against the Armenians, but that it should be seen through the prism that Turks have also suffered because of that, and that there was a mutual element that has led to this tragedy, right? And the question, of course, of proportion is another debate. But I mean, of course, Turkey is critical whenever a Western country, for example, decides to pass through its government the label that this was indeed a genocide, because from Ankara's point of view, the term genocide, as we've discussed, is a political term, one that can be assigned to many things, and that when you assign the term genocide, well, you're trying to kind of, point the finger to Turkey that it is responsible for atrocities which are on par with what, Hitler has done. Because this is essentially the connotation that you're trying to draw, and this is why it's
the association we have with
exactly,
that word,
and so this is why it's always been I think a very kind of hard topic to talk about, but at the same time it's been kind of very divisive whenever a country. Last time, I think a couple of years ago, it was the United States which decided to accept it as a genocide. That every time you make this gesture today, it is a gesture done not for sometimes historical accuracy, but to send a red flag meaning. And this is how it is interpreted from Ankara's side, that it's not about historical facts, it's about politics and today's politics and the fissures and the problems that the West has towards Turkey and Turkey has towards the West, and then this is part of a bigger game as a result.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, Adam Michalski, for joining us once more.
Pleasure to be here.
That's it. That's all we have time for. So join us again next time, which is, as you should know, every Tuesday, 9:35 p.m, 21:35 CET. Do join us then.